Welcome to Hamburgers and Horror, the home of meat, monsters, and Michael Myers. I'm Noah Hook, and today, folks, we are beginning our journey through the Halloween franchise. What started as a low-budget independent slasher by a young director has turned into a humongous franchise spanning over 40 years now. There are currently 11 Halloween movies with variable continuity and quality. We've got 2 more sequels in the works, with Halloween Kills coming out this October. I've lined up my reviews so I'll be able to cover it when it hits theaters, and I gotta get my Michael lore down pat before then. Join me over the next 4 months as I go through all of Michael, Laurie, Jamie, and Dan's escapades, as we recap how weird these movies get later on. But long before Michael was a cult spawn or Busta Rhymes punching bag, he was just the Shape. A mysterious, motiveless, merciless killer who took the world by storm in 1978. The original Halloween takes place in an Illinois suburb where escaped murderer Michael Myers returns to continue his childhood killing spree. He's pursued by police and his psychiatrist as he takes a particular interest in a high school babysitter and her friends, who find themselves hunted by their town's infamous boogeyman. Halloween was directed by a 30-year-old, relatively unknown John Carpenter. He'd already directed Dark Star and Assault on Precinct 13, so his talent had been recognized, but Halloween is what really made him a household name. Carpenter's of course gone on to direct, write, produce, and compose for movies like They Live, Escape from New York, and The Thing. He has a huge list of films, and most of them are absolute classics. Film producers Irwin Yablans and Mustafa Akkad loved Carpenter's work and reached out to him with the idea of a babysitter stalking killer. They felt it was a premise that would quickly impact the audience, as most people have either been a babysitter or been babysat, and it would obviously put kids in danger. Carpenter was on board as long as he could have full creative control, which is why he also wrote the screenplay and the score for the film. He and his at-the-time girlfriend, Deborah Hill, wrote the screenplay together. Hill would go on to write and produce for a ton of films, including The Fog, The Dead Zone, and Big Top Pee-wee. At first, the film was going to be called The Babysitter Murders, but Yablans recommended centering the film around Halloween, which ultimately became the title. Carpenter and Hill took inspiration from Celtic Halloween traditions, which asserts that day or season allowed otherworldly beings to more easily enter our own. It's not super apparent in the original, but the series dives deeper into those themes later on. Carpenter drew on haunted house folklore to build up the persona of Michael through Loomis and children so we could learn about him while he is just a silent killer. He has openly described Halloween as exploitation, playing on the fears and imaginations of the audience. He wanted Michael to be a big mystery, having us wonder where he'd pop up next and if he is even human. Halloween's budget was really small, totaling $320,000. Carpenter himself only took home $10,000, and the actors had similarly low salaries. That actually kept a lot of big names from joining the project, including Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, who were approached for the role of Loomis. Horror veteran Donald Pleasance is a G though, and jumped on the project for just $20,000. Jamie Lee Curtis wasn't Carpenter's first choice for Laurie Strode, but the bigger names he wanted were all unavailable. Curtis was only 19 years old and pretty unknown at the time, but her mom being Marion fucking Crane definitely helped. This role obviously skyrocketed Jamie's career, and she'd go on to star in Terror Train, Freaky Friday, Knives Out, and more than a few Halloween sequels. Nancy Kyes and Charles Cyphers, who both starred in Assault on Precinct 13, were cast as the Brackets. PJ Souls from Carrie and Stripes was cast as Linda, and Brian Andrews from The Great Santini and Days of Our Lives was cast as Tommy Doyle. Michael himself was played by Nick Castle for just $25 a day. Castle would go on to write and direct films like The Last Starfighter, Dennis the Menace, and Escape from New York. Unmasked Michael was played by Tony Moran, who returned for Halloween 2 for just $250. Halloween was shot on a tight 4-week schedule, and cinematographer Dean Cundy used a new Steadicam system to film, which allowed them to move smoothly through spaces. Tommy Lee Wallace was brought on as the production designer, art director, location scout, and co-editor. He's the guy who created the iconic mask, which was a Captain Kirk mask he picked up from a Halloween store and painted white and doctored up a bit. Deborah Hill describes the mask as faceless, as Michael could be anybody or anything underneath. Halloween premiered in October of '78 and quickly made over $1 million in its first week. It ended up grossing $70 million, becoming one of the most successful indie films at the time. They really couldn't afford advertising, so the movie spread through word of mouth, and despite the big numbers, a lot of critics weren't fans at the time of its release. Halloween was called childish, moody, and lacking any originality, and it wasn't until Siskel and Ebert and a few other critics gave it positive reviews that it started being re-evaluated. Previous naysayers began to praise the movie's camera work, tension, and scares. It's gone on to have a ton of TV appearances, video sales, and theatrical re-releases, and it's now considered one of the best movies of 1978 and one of the best horror films of all time. It's still beloved and widely regarded, holding a 96 and 89 on Rotten Tomatoes. While clearly inspired by movies like Black Christmas, Halloween is the movie most responsible for the boom of slashers we got in the 80s, as it's been replicated thousands of times. It popularized many of the tropes we know and love, and its themes are still talked about to this day. I could go on and on about Halloween's accolades and influence, but it's probably time we jump into Haddonfield and see what the big deal is for ourselves. Everybody grab your shirt hangers, because we're watching Halloween. The movie opens with that iconic score, title card, and sneaky jack-o'-lantern that looks like a knife-wielding Mike. We jump back to Halloween 1963 in Haddonfield as an unknown POV heads toward a house. The figure watches a couple inside as they head upstairs to get freaky, and he heads inside through an open back door. A child's hand grabs a knife from a cabinet and watches as Mr. Two-Pump Chump heads out for the night. The figure heads upstairs and picks up the guy's clown mask. He creeps up behind the topless young woman, who yells at her little brother Michael before he starts stabbing her. Watch your form there, Mike. Make sure you hit those arteries. Yeah, that's how you do it. Michael, still a POV, heads out the front door just as his parents pull up. They remove the mask to reveal he is only 6 years old, and the parents stand in confusion as Michael stares off into the night. We jump ahead 15 years to 1978 at Smith's Grove Sanitarium, where Michael has been locked up since. Dr. Sam Loomis and Nurse Marion Chambers will be escorting Michael to a court hearing, and we learn he hasn't spoken a word since that Halloween night. Loomis refers to Michael as it and says not to underestimate him. He never wants Michael to be released from Smith's Grove and hopes the judge will agree. They pull up to find a bunch of patients wandering around in the rain, meaning something bad has happened. Loomis goes to unlock a gate, and Michael hops onto the car, grabbing at Marion until she abandons the vehicle. Mikey hops in and skirts away into the night. We're back to Haddonfield on Halloween as senior Laurie Strode heads to school. Her realtor dad asks her to drop a key off at the Myers house, and she walks with Tommy Doyle, a boy she babysits. Tommy is spooked by the Myers house and its ghost stories, and Laurie drops the key off, unaware the house has been occupied. Doyle dips, and Mikey watches Laurie for a good long while. Loomis is fucking pissed that Michael escaped, and is certain he is heading back to Haddonfield, which is 150 miles away. Dr. Wynn is skeptical, as Michael can't even drive.
Was doing very well last night. Maybe someone round here gave him lessons.
Laurie is taking notes when she notices an already masked Michael watching her from across the street. But even his creepy ass can't stop her from being a smarty pants, as she and the teacher discuss a story in which fate is personified, and it's something nobody can stop. That's what we call a theme. Oh, Michael gone. Some boys tease Tommy about the boogeyman, and one of them runs right into the real thing. Michael takes an interest in Tommy and hops in his whip to get a better look at the future victim. Loomis is on his way to Haddonfield, and he warns the apathetic police about Michael. He notices an abandoned truck where he finds Michael's hospital gown and Marion's matchbook. But he does run off before he can find a dead mechanic, which is where Michael got his coveralls. Laurie's walking home with her friends Linda and Annie, who are both a bit more premarital than Laurie. She notices Michael approaching, and Annie's lame-ass speed kills line makes him stop dead in his tracks. He eventually heads off, and the gals plan to hang out that night, as Annie is babysitting right across from Tommy Doyle, who Laurie is watching for the evening. Linda heads inside, and Laurie sees Michael doing some shrub maintenance. Annie didn't see him, and Mike is gone when she tries to confront him. Annie chastises her for being an uptight bookworm and heads inside, and Laurie bumps into Annie's dad, Sheriff Brackett, before heading home herself. She looks out a window and Michael is checking out the laundry, but then he disappears again. She answers a phone call, which is just the sound of chewing, but a second call reveals it was just Annie. Meanwhile, Lumi is visiting the grave of Judith Myers, or at least where it used to be. Laurie watches some trick-or-treaters while waiting for Annie to pick her up, and they head to the kids' houses, unaware they are being followed. Annie notices her dad up ahead, so the gals hide their joint and learn a hardware store was broken into. The culprit took some masks, rope, and some knives, and Dr. Loomis is here to tell him exactly who's responsible. Too bad the good doctor doesn't realize his patient is right behind him. Laurie is nervous that Mr. Brackett knew they were high, and sad she doesn't have a date to the dance. She'd like to go with Ben Tramer, but something tells me his future will be a bit more explosive. These damn kids must live far away because it's dark by the time they get there. Michael watches Laurie head inside the Doyles and Annie inside the Wallaces across the street. Brackett and Loomis are checking out the Myers house, which hasn't been lived in since the murder. They find a dead dog, which Brackett thinks was killed by a skunk. Good police work, Sheriff. Loomis believes the pooch was a snack for Michael, and they head up to Judith's room. The window is broken by something, and Loomis whips out his piece. Brackett asks why he is so scared, and Loomis tells him all about Michael.
6-year-old child with this blank, pale, emotionless face and the blackest eyes. The devil's eyes.
He spent 8 years trying to rehabilitate him, but decided he needed to stay locked up forever, as Michael is filled with pure, simple evil. Loomis suspects he will come back here again and requests that the public not be notified so as not to create a panic. Tommy is showing Laurie his comic collection, and Lester, the Wallace's dog, tries to scare Michael away. Annie has set Laurie up with Ben Tramer without her permission, and Tommy notices Michael outside. He tries to show Laurie, but you already know Michael's gone. Michael watches as Annie spills some butter and strips, and he proceeds to kill Lester the dog. We get a peek at future Carpenter plans, and Laurie tells Tommy the boogeyman isn't real. He insists he saw him though, but Laurie promises to keep him safe. Pantsless Annie is washing her clothes in the weird separate laundry room, and Michael is closer than ever. The door slams and she gets locked inside, and Lindsay Wallace is too busy to let her out. Annie tries to crawl out the window, but her boyfriend Paul calls, so Lindsay finally helps her. Annie and Paul plan a night of coitus, and Michael is hoping to unicorn. Annie drops Lindsay off at the Doyle so she can pick up Paul, and goes to grab the keys for the locked car. She doesn't notice the car is unlocked when she returns, and Michael pops up in the back seat. He strangles her for a while, and she tries to call for help with the car horn, but he finishes her with a throat slash. Tommy watches Michael carry her body inside the Wallace house, and starts screaming about the boogeyman. Laurie is tired and shuts that shit down though. Loomis is still hanging around the Myers house, but he's got nothing better to do than scare some kids. Brackett returns and is getting more skeptical that Michael is in town. Loomis says Michael is inhumanly patient, but death has returned to Haddonfield, and soon its presence will be known. Brackett reluctantly decides to stay with him, and Linda and her boyfriend Bob arrive at the Wallace house. The drunken teens are surprised to find the house dark and empty, but decide kissing and not looking around at all is the best course of action. Linda calls and asks about Annie, but she assumes she is still picking up Paul. Linda and Bob decide it's time to fuck in this house they shouldn't be in, but apparently Bob can't keep it up with the ringing phone. They take it off the hook and get back to it as Michael shadows his way by. Bob heads downstairs to grab some brewskis, but gets distracted by a creaking door. Michael bursts from a pantry and lifts him up, pinning Bob to the wall with his big-ass chef's knife. Take time to appreciate your work, Mike. You earned it. With even more pizzazz, Michael returns to Linda in a Ghost Bob costume. Bob seems less interested in boobs now and won't answer any of Linda's questions. She thinks Bob is just being weird and gives Laurie a call to find out where Annie is. But by the time she answers, Michael is choking Linda to death with the phone cord. Turns out Linda's screams sound a lot like sex, and Laurie thinks it's just Annie messing with her. Michael finishes her and hangs up, and Laurie gets more concerned when nobody picks up the phone when she calls back. Loomis, after literal hours of waiting, finally notices the stolen car is right across the street and starts actively looking for Michael. Laurie checks on the kids and heads over to check on Annie and the others. She gets no response from anyone and heads around back. She enters through the open back door and slowly follows a few noises she hears throughout the house. She thinks the others are playing a prank on her and approaches the only lit bedroom. Here she unfortunately finds Annie and Judith Meyer's grave in an artsy display. Laurie is distraught and bumps into the closet where Bob's carcass comes swinging down. Finally, Linda and her stupid-ass death face reveal themselves in another closet. Laurie cries in the hallway for a bit instead of running the fuck out, and evil William Shatner emerges from the darkness. He slashes Laurie's arm and she goes flying over the banister to the first floor. Michael starts making his way down, and for some reason Laurie can't get out through the front door. Looks like Michael has also jerry-rigged the back door, and he starts breaking into the kitchen. He gets inside, and Laurie breaks the glass to keep this final girl circuit going. She screams for help, but finds little from the neighbors and runs back to the Doyle house. She's lost her keys, and Michael makes his slow walk over to her. She wakes up sleepy-ass Tommy, who lets her in right before Michael can get her. She sends him upstairs and arms herself with a knitting needle. I think this is an open window. It's always confused me a bit, but Michael appears from behind the couch and slashes at her. Laurie gives him a needle to the neck and the shape collapses. Now Laurie got the knife, but she decides Mike looks pretty dead and drops it. Meanwhile, Loomis and Brackett are still being completely useless. Laurie checks on the kids and ensures them that they're safe now as she's killed the boogeyman.
You can't kill the boogeyman.
You're right, Tommy, cause Michael is up and ready to party. Laurie locks the kids away and hops into a closet. She tries to tie it shut, but Michael starts shaking and breaking his way inside. Laurie grabs a shirt hanger and makes an impromptu shank, sticking it in Michael's eye. He drops his knife and she stabs him in the gut. He collapses again, and Laurie drops the knife again. She sends the kids to the neighbors to contact the police, and while she rests, Michael shows off his core strength. Loomis sees these screaming children and doesn't even talk to them, he just heads inside. Michael is creeping up behind Laurie and starts strangling her. Loomis gets upstairs and Laurie manages to rip off Mike's mask, revealing his pretty normal looking face. He remasks and Loomis gives him a pop. Then Loomis gives him 5 more pops, which sends Mike over the balcony. Laurie asks Loomis if that was the boogeyman, and Loomis sees there isn't a dead Michael where there should be. The movie ends with Michael's heavy breathing as we revisit the various locations he has lurked and wonder where he'll strike next. And that's Halloween. It's a fantastic slasher and it still holds up today. It's up there with my favorites as it is for many horror fans. It's just really well made, especially considering the budget Carpenter was working under. The camera is constantly moving around and utilizing interesting angles, and there is great use of foreground and background. It's paced really well, and there's a lot of build-up before Michael actually begins his slaughter. His presence is so slow and ominous. Nick Castle does a great job making him feel almost robotic, like killing is a hardwired objective in his system. But he does have a few personality flares here and there. His kills are actually pretty tame by today's standard, but that pretty much goes for every 70s horror movie. We weren't quite in Gore City yet. Halloween helped cement the teenage victim setup that would become a slasher standard, and it also helped reinforce the good girl becomes the final girl trope, which Carpenter really didn't intend to do. Intentional or not, Michael's fixation with horny babysitters, much like his sister, is hard to dismiss. Halloween is a film that's been cited many times in discussions of feminism and horror. A knock against Halloween and the slasher genre is that it often reduces women down into helpless eye candy. Others have found slashers like Halloween to actually be the first genre to really let young women be the protagonists, which often involves them overpowering the killer by the end and empowering themselves. While Loomis does ultimately save her, Laurie spends the bulk of the finale fighting and outsmarting Michael herself, and her survival is ultimately her own triumph. I can certainly admit the genre as a whole has a big issue with objectifying women, but I think Halloween has a lot more going on with that, but it is a very complex subject and I would really need a whole nother video to discuss that. Like Black Christmas, Halloween makes the viewer actively participate in the first killing, putting us behind the mask to kill Judith. This opening helps the viewer feel more involved from the start, and it creates a weird tension in the viewer as we are forced to identify with Michael. It's also the first slasher I can think of that really utilizes the suburban setting, which were supposed to be the safest neighborhoods across America. It's also terrifying that the reason he targeted Laurie was pretty much just awful luck. If she hadn't dropped the key off at the Myers house that specific morning, she would have probably been fine. Question though, did a family actually tour the Myers house that day with Mr. Strode? Maybe they did while Michael was watching Laurie at school. There are a few hiccups here and there in the movie. It makes no sense how it took Loomis so long to spot the car, or how Michael robbed that hardware store but had his mask way before then. It does take Michael a long time to really start killing, and the death scene acting is pretty bad. The overall acting is pretty solid though. The teenage friends are fine, but it's definitely Donald Pleasance and Jamie Lee Curtis that steal the show. This go-around, I realized Loomis is really a minor character in the original movie. He helps us learn about Michael, but he really doesn't do anything aside from spit cool-ass monologues until the last minute of the movie. That's not a critique or anything, I just forgot he's not as involved in this one as he is in some of the sequels. There are some solid kills in the movie. Annie's is really prolonged, and Bob's is really sudden, and a great display of Mike's ridiculous strength. His final pursuit of Laurie is fantastic, and every time Michael returns is terrifying. It's really impressive how scary Michael is, especially given the lack of jump scares and blood in the movie. His mere presence just reeks of evil, and you're honestly spending more time looking in the background for him to make sure he's not right behind the character. Halloween is a horror movie firing on all cylinders, from the cinematography to the music to the atmosphere. It has a distinct vision and enough dedicated talent to pull it off on such a low budget. They build so much tension throughout the runtime, and they very rarely give the viewer a moment to rest. I'd say the original Michael Myers is the single scariest slasher put to screen. I don't think he's ever as effective again, for reasons we'll see later in the franchise, but that doesn't take away from this landmark achievement in horror history. I'm sure 99% of you have seen Halloween a bunch of times and love it, but for any of you that haven't seen it, go give it a watch. It's basically mandatory viewing, both for its quality and for the influence it's had on the genre. Halloween is a slick, patient movie that takes its time to immerse the viewer and scare them. It's an absolute classic and many horror fans' all-time favorites, and for good reason. Well, that's about it. Next week we'll be looking at 1981's Halloween 2, which follows up immediately after the first one. Thank you all for joining me, and an extra thank you to my patrons. As always, I'm Noah Hook, and this has been Hamburgers and Horror. Stay safe out there. Thanks for watching my review of Halloween. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe so you can keep up with my weekly horror reviews. And if you want to help support the channel further, you should check out my Patreon account. You'll be able to vote for future movies and franchises I cover on the channel. Thanks y'all.